China is the world's largest importer of crude oil. It brings in more than 10 million barrels per day, much of it from the Middle East and Africa. Though it doesn't arrive by land, it travels thousands of kilometers by sea. Most of passes through the same place, the Strait of Malacca. At its narrowest point, this route is just about 2.7 kilometers. Every day, massive oil tankers squeeze through it, carrying energy that powers factories, cities, and entire industries across China. Now here's the problem. For years, close to 80% of China's imported oil depended on this single choke point. If something goes wrong here, whether it's a naval blockade, conflict, or even a major accident, it doesn't just slow things. It can directly affect China's economy. And China doesn't control this. The strait sits between countries like Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia. It also falls within a region where the United States Navy maintains a strong presence. That means China relies heavily on a route it does not control, in a region where other powers operate freely. This is what analysts often call the Malacca dilemma. China's energy supply depends on a single narrow passage that can't be fully secured by China itself. So the question becomes obvious. What do you do when most of your energy supply depends on a path you can't secure? China's answer was not to rely on the sea. Instead, they built a completely different route, one that starts on the coast of another country, cuts across mountains and remote terrain, and delivers oil directly into China without touching the Strait of Malacca at all. A 7 billion pipeline system running across Myanmar. But how exactly does this pipeline work? And more importantly, does it really solve the problem China was trying to fix? This is the China-Myanmar pipeline system, developed mainly by China National Petroleum Corporation, one of China's largest energy companies. The idea is simple on paper. Bring oil and gas to the western coast of Myanmar, unload it there, and then move it overland straight into China. The starting point sits at Kiokbo Port on the Bay of Bengal. From here, parallel pipelines run northeast across Myanmar and enter China's Yunnan province, eventually reaching the city of Kunming. It's actually two separate systems built side by side. The first is a natural gas pipeline. This one became operational in 2013. It carries gas from offshore fields in the Bay of Bengal as well as imports from other regions. The second is a crude oil pipeline which started operating in 2017. This is the one designed specifically to reduce dependence on the Malacca Strait. I might be thinking, if the idea is this straightforward, why wasn't this done earlier? Because building a pipeline across an entire country is not simple at all. And that's where the scale of this project really starts to show. This project looks simple on a map. In reality, the scale is massive. The pipeline stretches for about 770 kilometers, or about 479 miles, across Myanmar alone. It connects to China's internal network. The total system runs well over 2,500 kilometers, or about 1,554 mi, feeding directly into refineries and distribution systems deep inside the country. And it's not just long, it's built to handle serious volume. The crude oil pipeline can move around 440,000 barrels per day. That's enough to supply a large industrial region on its own. The natural gas pipeline adds another layer with a capacity of roughly 12 billion cubm per year. But moving oil and gas over this distance is not just about laying a pipe in the ground. You need pumping stations to keep the oil moving. You need compressor stations for gas. You need storage terminals, monitoring systems, and constant pressure control across hundreds of kilometers. Now add geography to that. The route cuts through mountains, dense forests, and remote regions where basic Infrastructure barely existed before construction started. In many areas, workers had to build access roads first, just to bring in equipment. Then comes the technical side. Pipelines like this have to maintain stable pressure across long distances. If pressure drops too much, flow slows down. If it rises too much, it can damage the system. That means constant monitoring and adjustment across the entire route. On top of that, the pipeline has to deal with temperature changes, elevation differences, and environmental conditions that vary from coastal regions to highland terrain. So the concept is straightforward. The execution is anything but. But even with all this scale, the real question is how exactly does this help China avoid the problem it started with? The process is more straightforward than most people expect. Oil tankers from the Middle East or Africa don't need to sail all the way to China's eastern ports anymore. Instead, they stop much earlier, at Kyaku on Myanmar's western coast. There, the oil gets unloaded directly into storage facilities connected to the pipeline. From that point, the route changes completely. That means a significant portion of the journey shifts from ocean to land. Now compare the two routes. The traditional path runs from the Middle East across the Indian Ocean through the Strait of Malacca and then up to China's eastern coastline. That route is longer, more congested, and passes through a narrow choke point. The alternative route still uses the Indian Ocean, but it cuts inland much earlier. Once the oil reaches Myanmar, it bypasses Southeast Asia completely and enters China from the southwest. This change does two things. First, it shortens the shipping distance by several thousand km, depending on the origin of the oil. Second, and more important, it reduces reliance on a single vulnerable route. But here's the key point. This pipeline doesn't replace the Strait of Malacca. China still depends heavily on maritime imports, and most of its oil still flows through that choke point. The pipeline handles only a portion of total demand. However, it gives China an alternative. And in energy security, having an alternative route, even if it covers only part of your supply, can make a major difference. It also strengthens China's western regions. Most of China's major ports sit on the eastern coast, but bringing oil and gas into Yunnan province, this pipeline supports development in the southwest, an area that historically had less direct access to global trade routes. Now look at Myanmar. On paper, this project brings clear economic benefits. The country earns transit fees from oil and gas passing through its territory. It also gains infrastructure, roads, facilities, and energy access tied to the pipeline system. There is also investment around Key Port with plans for industrial zones that could create jobs and expand local economic activity, but the situation is not entirely positive. Pipelines are fixed assets. Ships, you can't route them easily. Something disrupts the pipeline, whether it's political instability, local conflict, or sabotage, the flow stops immediately. And Myanmar is not the most stable environment for a project of this. The pipeline runs through regions that have faced conflict and security challenges that creates ongoing risks that don't exist in open sea routes. Then there's maintenance. The pipeline, stretching hundreds of kilometers, requires constant monitoring. Pressure issues or technical failures can interrupt operations. And in remote terrain, even basic repairs can take. So while the pipeline avoids one vulnerability, it introduces others. This is why China didn't treat this project as a single solution. Building multiple alternatives so that no single point can disrupt its energy supply. The Myanmar pipeline is one of those routes. But China didn't stop. To the west, China built one of the largest overland energy corridors in the world across Central Asia. Pipelines from Turkmenistan run through Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan before entering China's Xinjiang region. The lines, known as Lines A, B, and C, together deliver around 55 billion cubic meters of gas per year. Another expansion, often called Line D, planned to add roughly 30 billion cubme annually. That means the single corridor could eventually push over 80 billion cub-m of gas into China every year. There is also an oil pipeline from Kazakhstan into China, stretching over 2,200 kilometers or about 1,367 miles, moving crude directly across. This reduces the need for ships and avoids maritime choke points completely. Then look to the north. China connected its network to Russia through the power of Siberia. The pipeline runs for more than 3,000 kilometers or about 1,864 miles and is designed to supply up to 38 billion cubic meters of gas per year. Once it reaches full capacity, started delivering gas in 2019 and is still ramping up. There are also ongoing plans for a second route, often referred to as Power of Siberia 2, which could add another 50 billion cubic meters annually if completed. Now shift to the China has invested heavily in Pakistan's Gwadar port under the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. The concept is similar to Myanmar. Bring oil and other goods by sea and move it inland. But the scale of the challenge is much larger. The distance from Gwadar to China's Xinjiang region is over 3,000 km, and much of that route passes through high-altitude terrain, including parts of the Karakoram Range. Building a full-scale pipeline across this route is far more complex, which is why progress has been slower. Inside China, all of these routes connect into a massive domestic system. China has built over 100,000 kilometers of oil and gas pipelines. Internally, this network links coastal import terminals, inland refineries, and industrial zones, allowing energy to move in multiple directions depending on demand. So if more gas arrives from Central Asia, it can be redirected east. If more oil enters through Myanmar, it can move north or further inland. Everything ties together into one integrated system. Now compare this to relying on a single route like the Strait of Malacca. At one point, close to 80% of China's oil imports passed through that narrow passage. That creates a serious vulnerability. That route is disrupted, millions of barrels per day are affected almost immediately. But once multiple alternatives exist, the situation changes. Each one carries a portion of the total. That's the real strategy here. China is not trying to avoid the Strait of Malacca completely. It is making sure that it is no longer the only option. And this is where the Myanmar pipeline fits in. Even if it carries less than 5% of total oil imports, that still represents hundreds of thousands of barrels per day that don't depend on the same choke point. So this pipeline is not the solution on its own. It is part of a much larger system designed around one idea. No single route should ever be able to control China's energy supply. So now the question shifts to you. Is building multiple smaller routes better than relying on one major global route? Can pipelines like this really protect a country during a major conflict? They just shift the risk somewhere else? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you are enjoying content like this on Insane of Curiosity, make sure to like, subscribe, and share the video with your friends and family. Your support helps us bring more deep dive stories and global mysteries to the channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.